Okay, so in this chapter, chapter 21, we're talking about two forms of government that showed up in Europe starting around 1500 and lasted until about 1800 with the American and French revolutions. And those two things were absolutism and constitutionalism. Now, absolutism was definitely the more common method of government we see in a lot more countries, and it grew out of all the changes that were happening with the Renaissance and the Reformation. And the basic idea behind absolutism is that there are no limits on the power of the ruler. The ruler has absolute power, so there's really nothing legally that he can't do. Now, in reality, there are all kinds of things that could restrict a ruler's power. You know, he might not have enough money to do the things he wants. He might not be able to get the nobles to go along with it. Or, you know, he might just not have the technology to achieve what he wanted to do. But basically, the idea was that there was nothing that the ruler couldn't do. And a lot of this is based on this idea called divine right, which you see bolded there under absolutism. And divine right was the idea that the power of the ruler came directly from God. And as the representative of God on earth, you know, the ruler didn't have to answer to anyone but God. So his subjects were just supposed to obey him without question because he was God's, you know, representative on earth. And the main countries where you saw absolutism practiced with varying degrees of success are listed there: Spain, France, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Now, on the flip side, you had a few areas where you had constitutionalism, and this was this idea that the government, and it could be either a monarchy or a republic, didn't really matter which one, but whatever it was, the power of that government was limited by law. And this could be a document, like in England, the Magna Carta, which we looked at in chapter 14, or it could just be a series of rules and regulations that the people have put into place, which was the case in the Netherlands. And basically, England and the Netherlands, or the Dutch Republic, these were the only two countries in Europe that practiced this constitutionalism, this idea of having some kind of set of laws or rules, a constitution, that would restrict the power of the government. So it's the exact opposite of absolutism. And where these two ideas came from, if we go on to letter B here, it's all the changes that were taking place at the end of the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance and Reformation. So the stuff we talked about in chapters 14 and 17. You had feudalism and the manor system declining because of the Black Death and the Hundred Years' War. And those presentations that we saw on those events told us all about how the lower population meant that serfs getting more freedom. The Hundred Years' War gave more power to the kings of England and France, and so kind of set in motion some of these changes. Also, the second thing there, that growth of trade, which we saw in chapter 17 with the Renaissance. So the growth of trade in the middle class, you know, means that kings were getting richer, and that middle class people were willing to pay money to the kings and give them more power in return for peace and stability, which would then help trade expand even further, right? You know, if there's war going on like the Hundred Years' War, it's hard to safely, you know, trade goods from one place to another. But if there's a king with a lot of power who can establish order and stability, that's good for trade, and the merchants and middle class people like that. And then finally, you know, the third and last point there is that after all the years of religious and civil wars that we saw in chapter 17, you know, people fighting with each other over religion, they were just happy to have a ruler who would bring peace and order and stability. And so this chart on the right kind of sums up some of the causes and effects of absolutism. It's important to know this because there's always this struggle over how much power the government should have, and it's an ongoing struggle. You know, absolutism kind of fell away after the French and American revolutions, but it's always ready to come back, and we'll see this again in the 20th century with people like Hitler and Stalin, you know, who will bring back absolute types of governments, and then, you know, we have to fight to destroy those governments and then bring freedom and democracy back. So this is a map of Europe during the time period that we're talking about 1500 to 1800, and just to kind of give you a sense of, you know, the countries where absolutism existed in Spain and France, in Austria and Prussia and Russia, and then England and the Netherlands were the only ones really where you had any kind of, you know, democracy or representative government. So if we look at the case of Spain, which is the first absolute government that's discussed in the textbook, and it really starts with the ruler Philip II, who came into power in the 1550s, you know, not long after the Reformation had gotten started in the rest of Europe. And although we didn't cover this previously, by this point in time, Spain had already conquered South America and Mexico and created a huge empire in the Americas. And that empire gave Spain a tremendous amount of wealth. A lot of gold and silver was found in the Americas, and this was shipped back to Spain. And you can see in this chart on the right, with each decade, or a couple of decades, the millions of pounds of gold and silver coming into Spain from the Americas, really reaching its peak during the reign of Philip II, and then kind of dropping off after that. So Spain became very powerful in a very short amount of time, and with all that wealth, like we saw in Renaissance Italy, it becomes a center of the arts and of culture. But by the 1600s, the mid-1600s, Spain was declining, and there's a couple of reasons for that, which are outlined below. First, you had a lot of weak leaders after Philip II. The kings that came after him were not very strong, and they couldn't really hold the empire together. Probably the biggest problem Spain had were the economic problems, which we see in the next couple of bullets. The population of Spain grew really rapidly, but Spain wasn't producing a lot. They still had an old, outdated system of producing goods that made those goods really expensive, and that combined with all the gold and silver flooding into the country meant there was huge inflation. Prices were going up dramatically because the quantity of goods was really low, and people were just awash with money, especially the upper classes. Plus, you didn't really have a middle class in Spain either. You had a tiny group of very wealthy aristocrats and a huge group of really poor people, and really no one in between. And part of the reason you didn't have a middle class in Spain was that last bullet. Spain was involved in a lot of wars with other European countries, and the Spanish court spent a huge amount of money. So they had to put these really high taxes on the people, and because the nobility were exempt from taxation, all the taxes fell on the common people, and so nobody had enough money to really start a business or produce things. And that government spending drove Spain into huge debt. So all this money was coming into Spain, but because the government was spending so much on war and on its court, all that money was going right back out again. And the Netherlands is kind of an interesting case, because the Netherlands was ruled by Spain, but there was a lot of tension between the people in the Netherlands and Spain. Unlike Spain, the Netherlands, as you can see here, was a wealthy center of trade, and in the northern part of the Netherlands, the majority of the people were Protestant, and they really disliked being ruled by the Catholic kings of Spain. And so in the 1500s, the Protestant majority in the north of the Netherlands got fed up with the Catholic policies and high taxation and revolted against Spain, and eventually won their independence. And once they were free, the Dutch Republic became an amazingly successful center of banking and commerce and art. They even practiced religious toleration. So the Dutch Republic, although most of the people were Protestant, they were unique because they welcomed people of all religious faiths into their nation, and that really benefited them because they brought in a lot of talented and intelligent and hardworking people from all areas of Europe that further contributed to their success. So here you see a map of the Spanish Empire as ruled by Philip II, and you can see that not only did Philip control all of Spain and Portugal, right, but he also controlled the Netherlands, some areas in Central Europe, and all of southern Italy. So this was a pretty large empire, and it was pretty hard for him to defend it, but he was constantly trying to fight other people to defend the Catholic faith and hold on to his territory. And he had a couple of military ventures which were very expensive. One was the Battle of Lepanto down here in Greece, and this was one of Philip's few successes in 1571 when he defeated the Ottoman Empire, which you can see was a major power in the Mediterranean Sea. By defeating the Ottoman navy, that gave Spain more control of the Mediterranean Sea, which helped its trade. But unfortunately, about a decade or so later, in 1588, Philip tried to invade England with the famous Spanish Armada. England had left the Catholic Church. England was supporting the people in the Netherlands who were revolting against Spain, and so Philip wanted to invade England and overthrow its ruler and bring England back into the Catholic Church and stop it from fighting against him. The Spanish Armada was a massive fleet, thousands of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers, but when the fleet left Spain to attack England, it hit bad weather in the English Channel, and the English Navy, even though it was smaller, was much faster and more maneuverable, and the Spanish Armada was destroyed. And this was a huge loss that really weakened Spain. It was a huge blow to its military. It lost a lot of money on the Spanish Armada. So this was a major disaster for Spain that it never really recovered from. Like I said, that wealth coming in from Spain led to, from the Americas coming into Spain, led to a golden age in art and literature. And a couple of examples here. El Greco is one of the more famous artists. He was originally from Greece, but he moved to Spain and lived there and produced artwork there. And if you think about this in comparison to some of the Renaissance paintings that we saw in the last chapter, you can see kind of the difference. You know, you've now had, since the end of the Renaissance, hundreds of years of civil war, religious tensions, persecution, witchcraft, hysteria, all kinds of problems, and the artwork really reflects that. El Greco's paintings have all these elongated, sort of tortured-looking people, not the, glorious, anatomically perfect, bodies that we saw in Renaissance art, but now there's a lot more agony and uncertainty. And because of the Protestant Reformation, people are turning more and more to religion. And in this case, El Greco is kind of looking at his Catholic faith as a way to, find hope in the midst of all the tension and bloodshed that was going on in Europe at the time. A very different artist is Diego Velázquez, who was the royal court painter for the royal family in Spain in the late 1500s. And Diego Velázquez, and early 1600s, this is one of his most famous paintings, and it's meant to kind of show the power and majesty of the royal family. And it's really interesting painting, too, because it's showing the children here all dressed in their fine clothes, but you're actually seeing in this painting from the point of view of the King and Queen of Spain. And you can actually see them reflected in this mirror in the back of the room. And this is Velázquez himself right here. He painted himself into the image, and you can see his canvas right along here to kind of give you this sense of the majesty and greatness of the Spanish royal family. Unfortunately, by this point, Spain was already well on its way to decline, and Velázquez would be kind of one of the last great artists in Spain. The Netherlands, also because of its success, if you think of like Renaissance Italy with the merchants and their wealth, and they supported the arts. Same thing happened in the Netherlands in the Dutch Republic. Once they became free of Spanish rule, a lot of the wealthy merchants supported artists and commissioned works of art. And if you think about how the Renaissance art reflected kind of the humanist values and the religious feelings of the people, the art being produced in the Netherlands kind of reflected the values of the people in the Dutch Republic. Many of them were Protestant, and they were successful merchants, so the art, like this famous painting by Rembrandt, represented the merchants and showed how their kind of hard work had led to their financial success. Okay, so moving on to France. France is kind of an interesting case because in the 1500s, France is really torn apart by a series of bloody religious wars between the Catholics and the Huguenots. And if you don't remember from chapter 17, Huguenots were the Protestants in France. They followed the teachings of John Calvin, and most of the Huguenots in France were from the middle class, and some from the aristocracy as well. So they were usually very intelligent, very wealthy. Many of them were very skilled. So although they were only about 10% of the population, they had a lot of power and influence. And so there were a lot of really horrible and bloody conflicts between the Catholics and the Huguenots. And in the early 1600s, a king named Louis XIII came to power, and he appointed as his advisor Cardinal Richelieu, who you see pictured on the right here. And Richelieu was really an interesting individual. He was a high-ranking church official, but he wanted to make France the strongest nation in Europe. And he really wanted to make the French monarchy the most powerful in all of Europe. And so he basically went after three targets, which you see outlined here. He went after the nobility. He weakened them by putting restrictions on them, by forcing them to take down the castles they had had since the Middle Ages, and by forcing them to work for the king. He also went after the Huguenots. The Huguenots had been granted religious toleration by an earlier king, Henry IV, in an effort to try to make peace in France. But Richelieu thought that the Huguenots were a danger, that they might revolt against the king at some point because they were Protestant and the king was Catholic. So Richelieu tried to weaken them as well. And then Richelieu also went after France's enemies outside the country, and that was mainly the Habsburg family, who were the rulers of Spain. This is the family from which Philip II, who we saw in the previous slide, came from. And you also had a Habsburg family that was in power in Germany. So basically, France was surrounded on all sides in Spain and in Germany by members of the Habsburg family. And so Richelieu wanted to make sure that France could hold its own against them. And so when a religious war called the 30 Years' War broke out in Germany between the Catholics and Protestants, Richelieu actually supported the Protestants and sent them money and weapons and equipment to help them fight against the Habsburgs. The idea being that if the Habsburgs in Germany were busy fighting a civil war inside Germany, then they wouldn't be able to take any action against France. Now, after Richelieu died and King Louis XIII died, a new ruler came into place, and this was Louis XIV, who began his rule in 1643. And he's famously referred to as the Sun King because he was really the most successful of all the absolute monarchs. He really tried to make himself the strongest ruler in all of France, and although he exceeded in some ways, in other ways, he left a lot of problems that will eventually lead later on to the French Revolution in 1789. So one of the first things that Louis did was to build a great and impressive palace at Versailles, about 12 miles outside of the city of Paris. And at this palace, Louis would have all the nobility come to him, and he would entertain them with parties and balls and theater, and basically keep them so busy with kind of intrigue and gossip and entertainment that they wouldn't have the ability to kind of work together and plot against him. So it was really kind of a brilliant way to distract the nobility and help keep himself in power. Of course, the problem was that Versailles was very expensive, and maintaining this constant flow of entertainment and parties was also very expensive, and it caused Louis to have to borrow a lot of money and put France in debt, which we'll hurt it later on. Louis also weakened the nobles, as we see in the second point, and he did this by involving more middle-class people in his government. So previously, the nobles were the main advisors of the kings in France, but what Louis did was give more power to these well-educated middle-class men that he made his advisors and lawyers and bureaucrats, and they did most of the work in his government. And because they owed their position based on their merit and their talent, they were much more loyal to the king than the nobility, who thought they were entitled to positions of power. Louis also strengthened the economy. He appointed a man named Jean-Baptiste Colbert to be his financial advisor, and Colbert's policy helped to make France very rich. But unfortunately, because Louis spent so much money on wars and the court, which we saw as a problem in Spain previously, a lot of that wealth that was produced by the economic policies ended up getting lost or wasted. Louis was also a big patron of the arts, and one of the big things or changes that takes place during the 1600s is that, in the Renaissance, as we saw in chapter 17, art was there to glorify, humanity, to glorify humanism and the human potential. Well, now, by this point in time, the real purpose of art is to glorify the ruler, and most of the art produced during Louis XIV's reign was designed to make him look great and incredible and powerful. And so finally, as I said, much like in Spain, that spending, is once again a major problem. And we see this as a problem even today for governments. When they spend too much money, it creates debt and great economic problems. And Louis spent a huge amount of money fighting a whole series of wars that really didn't gain him much. And then his court at Versailles was so expensive that it created a massive debt. And the French rulers that came after Louis XIV would be unable to pay off this debt, and that would be one of the major reasons that leads us into the French Revolution. So here you see pictured on the left one of the most famous portraits of Louis XIV, and of course all of the gaudy, really fancy clothing is designed to make him look even more powerful and impressive and awesome to his followers. But on the right, you see what I was talking about with that debt, and you can see how it sort of consistently climbs over the course of Louis XIV's reign, from when he first takes office in 1643, and then by the time he dies in 1715, as a result of his wars and his spending on the court, the debt for France has risen to a staggering amount, and it's going to be almost impossible for the people that come after Louis to pay off this debt. So here are just a couple of images of Versailles. On the left, you see a view of Versailles shortly after it's built, and you can see all the different wings of the palace where all the nobles would live and where a lot of the sort of entertainment and things would take place. And on the right here, you see an image of the famous Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. This is one of the biggest and most impressive areas in the Palace of Versailles. It's where a lot of these ceremonies and rituals and parties and dances would take place. And it's sort of this very magnificent, beautifully decorated room filled with gold and expensive paintings. And of course, even though this made Louis look very impressive and intimidate his rivals and his friends and enemies, it was also extremely expensive, which once again would create lots of problems in the future. So finally, we talk about England from section 5 of chapter 21. And England is the unique case because even though its rulers tried to create an absolute monarchy, they failed, and England winds up being one of our two areas where constitutionalism takes hold. So in England, the story starts in the 1600s after the death of Elizabeth, who we talked about in chapter 17. She dies in 1603, and because she didn't have any children, the throne passes to the sort of next people in line, which is the Stuart family, who were the rulers in Scotland. And the Stuart rulers, as we can see, really had a big problem because Parliament had become very powerful. And remember that Parliament is the representatives of the people, and after the Magna Carta and the Model Parliament and everything that had happened in the Middle Ages, the Parliament had a great deal of control over money, and they came into conflict with these Stuart rulers, not only over money, but also over who had more power, and also religion, because many members of Parliament were very strong Protestants, while the Stuart monarchs had a lot of Catholic sympathies, and that created religious tensions. So the second Stuart monarch, this guy Charles I, really had major problems with Parliament. He wanted to be an absolute ruler, but Parliament wanted a greater say in what was going on. And Charles ran into trouble because there was a rebellion in Scotland against his rule, and he needed money to crush the rebellion, which meant he had to go to Parliament. But Parliament wanted Charles to approve certain reforms that would limit his power and give Parliament more power. Charles refused, and as a result, you had the English Civil War, when the supporters of Charles fought with the supporters of Parliament. And although initially Charles had the upper hand, Parliament eventually found a great general in a man named Oliver Cromwell, who created this really powerful, disciplined army that managed to defeat Charles's forces. Charles was captured, he was executed, and Oliver Cromwell, although initially he supported creating a kind of republic, eventually became a military dictator. And this execution of Charles I was really a major event because it was the first time, really, in European history that a ruler was put on trial by his people and executed for essentially what they argued was committing crimes against them, for violating their rights. And this is going to be kind of a pattern we'll see in English history where the people are willing to, take up arms and fight for their rights. And we'll see it in the American Revolution. Well, Oliver Cromwell, after he became dictator, really became a very unpopular person because he was a strict Puritan, and his policies meant shutting down things like theaters and bars because he thought they were immoral. And after a while, people got kind of fed up with this. And after Cromwell and his son died in 1660, the people were so fed up with this kind of Puritan rule that they actually brought the Stuart family back. And this is called the Restoration, when Charles II came in and became the king. And Charles was a little bit smarter than than the other rulers in his family, and he more or less had a good relationship with Parliament, but his reign was relatively short, and when he died, his successor was James II. And James II was a really strong supporter of the Catholic Church, and of course by this time England is pretty strongly Protestant, and Parliament is very strongly Protestant, so they weren't too happy with James II and his pro-Catholic policies. And James II also really antagonized Parliament by showing them complete contempt. He tried to rule without their advice and consent. He would create, policies to get money without going through Parliament. And Parliament, put up with this for a while, but then James II had a son. And the leaders of Parliament were really afraid that this would mean a dynasty, a long line of rulers like James II, who were, arrogant, pro-Catholic, not willing to work with Parliament. So in 1688, you have the Glorious Revolution, where Parliament basically invites Mary, who was James's daughter, but who was very Protestant, and her husband William, who were over in the Netherlands. Parliament invites the two of them to come over and take power in England. James II chooses not to really fight for the throne. He more or less flees England, and so it's called the Glorious Revolution because it's relatively bloodless. William and Mary come in and take power without a whole lot of warfare or conflict. Now, one of the conditions that William and Mary had to meet, becoming the new King and Queen of England, was they had to accept a Bill of Rights that Parliament drafted. And this Bill of Rights reinforced many of the rights we originally saw back in the Magna Carta in Chapter 14, where there was no taxation without representation, where Parliament would have, a strong voice over policies and government decisions, and really kind of reinforcing that people couldn't be arrested without good reason, that everyone had to have a fair trial. A lot of ideas like that, things that we'll see eventually in our own Bill of Rights in the United States after the American Revolution. And so, really, as a result of this process, England wound up becoming a constitutional monarchy. So, you had a monarch, you had a king or queen, but there were these documents, the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, that limited and set restrictions on the power of the rulers. And this really differentiates England from the examples we saw in Spain and France, or in other countries like Austria, Prussia, and Russia, where absolute monarchs took power.